Hello, everyone. In our lesson today, let's discuss structured interviews. Now, we're talking about a particular category of interviews that we're referring to as structured interviews. Now, when we talk about structured interviews are an example of a primary source to quantitative data. This is considered as a primary source to quantitative data, a primary source of quantitative data, rather, quantitative data. Now, when we talk about these primary sources of quantitative data, let me remind you all there are three that are to be known in as a part of a syllabus. The first one is a questionnaire. The second one is a structured interview that we are doing right now. Structured interview. And the third one is an experiment that we'll be covering in our next lesson. We're already done with questionnaires. Next, we have structured interviews. I mean, that is structured interviews is what we're doing right now. And in the next lesson, we would be discussing experiments. So without any further ado, let's discuss what structured interviews are. When we or as we talk about structured interviews are a research method, let's just say a research method that an interviewer uses with a preset or pre-written questions. There are pre-written questions that are available there. There are preset questions that are already available. One, the first characteristic. I'll just drag this a little lower. Number two, when there are preset or pre-written questions, they would be standardized, as the name suggests, as well structured. So we're talking about standardized questions over here. Standardized questions, or in other words, the same questions would be there in the same order for every single participant. For all participants. Usually, when you talk about structured interviews, they help us with gathering consistent data. And consistent data is also referred to as reliable data. And of course, these are easier when it comes to comparisons because of its structured nature. So when we talk about structured interviews, we are talking about pre-written questions. These pre-written questions are asked from the participants in a standardized manner. That is, the interviewer uses the same order of questions, and which eventually consequently leads to the interviewer, that is the researcher in this case, being able to gather consistent, or in other words, reliable data, which again facilitates the researcher when it comes to comparisons. Comparisons become relatively way easier. So structured interviews are based on questions, or rather say a list of questions that the interviewer reads to the participants. The same questions are read in the same order to all participants. Now, usually these structured interviews contain questions that are very simple. Something as simple as how old are you? Something as simple as what is your occupation? Something as simple as did you vote in the last election? Now, when we talk about these structured interviews, there are a bit there. There's a bit more that we need to know about these structured interviews to begin with. If we talk about, wait, I think I would just sketch this down a little so that it gets easier for you to understand. So let's just say this is a paper we have. They're the same set of questions. The same set of questions would be asked from every single participant, right? Now, if there are, let's just say, one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine. These nine questions would be asked in the same manner from each participant. So, of course, when you're talking about structured interviews, there is no flexibility here. No flexibility. In other words, the interviewer cannot add a question if he or she wants. The interviewer cannot subtract any question either. It's the same format, same questions being asked in the same manner. When we, or as we talk about structured interviews, I would want to discuss cases where the response rate is low. Now, for the ones who do not recall, when I, or as I use the word response rate, I refer to, or we refer to, the percentage of individuals who actually respond back. Now, for instance, if the researcher intended on gathering information on a particular group of individuals, the percentage of people who respond back would be your response rate. So in the case of structured interviews, the reasons for a non-response might include the following. So let's talk about, I think I will need a little correction with this heading so that it is easier for you. Reasons for non-response in structured interviews. So the reasons that lead to individuals not responding to these structured interviews might include, the first one to begin with, it could be failure to make contact. Now, what does it mean when we say failure to make contact? For instance, you contacted someone, you wanted to contact someone whom you saw as a potential respondent, someone whom you saw as a potential interviewee, someone whom you saw as a potential participant, and you cannot, as a researcher, or you're not able to, as a researcher, be able to make contact with that particular person. That person might have moved away, might be on holidays, or simply may not be at home. So, when the researcher tries making a contact with the participant, in this case an interviewee, and he or she fails to make that contact, that might be a reason that might lead to a non response in the case of a structured interview. Now, let's just say another category over here could be, I mean, these are pretty self-explanatory. This is pretty simple to understand, nothing to worry about. Now, let's just say, let's talk about a situation when the researcher was able to make a contact, but because of some reason or the other, the interview cannot or could not be conducted. So, in cases where, despite of contact being made, if the interview is not conducted because of any reason, let's just say that particular day the respondent is not feeling the very best, is sick that day, interview may not be conducted. The third possible reason, potential reason, could be that, let's talk about a third situation over here where the researcher was able to make a contact with the participant, where the rather say potential participant was available as well, but the participant refuses to participate in the research. The potential participant refuses to participate in the interview or in the research. This could be because of lack of time, this could be because of lack of interest, so on and so forth. Now, we just spoke about structured interviews. Let me remind you all, structured interviews are a primary source of quantitative data. There are three different primary sources of quantitative data that are part of our syllabus. To begin with, the first one is questionnaires, second one structured interviews, and the third one is experiments. So now when we talk about these experiments is, I mean, we'd be discussing experiments in the next lesson. About questionnaires, we're already done with it. About structured interviews, a few salient features here. Structured interviews involve pre-written questions. There are pre-written questions there. These questions are standardized. These questions are asked in the same order from participants. That leads to consistent and reliable data, which makes comparison easier. And another major feature of these structured interview is lack of flexibility. Lack of flexibility because the researcher is expected to ask the same questions in the same manner from all participants. Now, if we move on and we talk about the strengths, let's talk about the strengths of using structured interviews. If we're talking about the strengths of these structured interviews, to begin with, the first one over here could be them being, less time required if you're comparing them with unstructured interviews, which of course require a lot more time. So they're usually conducted faster. They usually take less time and uh or let me just put it over here, because they take less time. This could be a possible reason behind them being more cost effective. This could be cheaper. Now, if you talk about a comparison, if I talk about a comparison between structured interviews with the other type of interviews, such as, let's just say, for the sake of comparison again, if I may talk about semi-structured interviews, or if I may talk about semi-structured interviews, if I may talk about unstructured interviews. Now, compared to these, essentially what the researcher is actually doing is the researcher is simply reading out questions. So they are more, they're, let's just say, easier to conduct as well, because at times the researcher only reads out questions. Because these interviews, they are conducted and in a very standardized manner with no chances of flexibility, this leads to there being less chances of interviewer bias. There being less chances of interviewer bias. We're talking about interviewer bias over here. Now, for this, we need to know what the word interviewer bias means. When we talk about interviewer bias, or as we use the word interviewer bias, we're talking about the effect of the interview situation itself on the participants' responses. Now, interviewer bias, or in other words, the possible effect of the interview situation on the participants' responses. There's a possibility that the participant might feel intimidated and not very comfortable answering questions. So that could be less chances of, and there could be, we could say there are less chance of interview bias because of the very nature of these structured interviews, because these questions are asked in a very standardized manner. So there's less chance of interview bias of the participant's answers being influenced by the interviewer by the age, gender, ethnicity, and let's just say the mannerism too. Now, another strength of using structured interviews over here could be the quantification of responses. In other words, the researcher could quantify the responses, and this stands to be true when you talk about closed questions. If in your interview there are closed questions that you've used as a researcher, there's a possibility, that would just make it easier for the respondent to, I'm sorry, that would just make it easier for the researcher to quantify all the responses, right? Now, let's just say you ask a question that says, a question that says, how old are you? I mean, you could very easily categorize teenagers over here from let's just say, adults, or let's just say middle-aged people, or any other category. So quantification becomes easy, but this stands to be true when it comes to using closed questions in a structured interview. The next advantage, or the next strength, or the next point in favor of structured interviews is they're more likely to produce data that can be directly compared. So, data gathered can be directly compared in many cases. Participants are Because the participants are being asked standardized questions, so the answers are not affected by possible differences in the wordings of the question. As a result, the researchers can identify patterns and correlations in the data. Now, see, if the data is quantifiable, if the data is quantitative data gathered from structured interviews can lead to the researcher being able to form patterns which might eventually lead to forming correlations, relationships between different variables. Again, another advantage that could possibly be used over here, positivists. Remember, I had mentioned this in the previous lesson as well. Positivists support using quantitative data. Positivists support quantitative data, numeric data, quantitative data. Positivists favor structured interviews because they generate responses that can be coded and compared. Structured interviews can also be replicated to check for reliability and allow generalizations. Now, again, as this next, okay, I might put the same point to use. So, because positivists support gathering quantitative data, I could say structured interviews are favored by positivists the collection of quantitative data may make it easier for the researcher, that is the interviewer in this case, the person who's conducting an interview. The collection of quantitative data may make it easier for the researcher, that is the interviewer, to replicate the research. To replicate the research, in other words, be able to conduct the same research in exactly the same manner. Because remember, there was this remember, structured interviews have a very standardized, there are pre-written questions that are asked from respondents, that is then interviewee, in a very standardized manner. So they support quantitative data. Structured interviews are favored by positivists. The collection of quantitative data may make it easier for the researcher, that is the interviewer, to replicate the interview, increasing chances of reliable, that is consistent findings, reliable findings. Now, I would want to take you back and show you a question that we have had on structured interviews in May, June 2021. Question number 13. The question that you all see over here is, explain two strengths of structured interviews. Now, this happens to be a 6-mark question. And for a 6-mark question, remember, because the examiner is asking you about any two strengths, like I keep on telling students, consider this as two different questions of 3 marks each. I mean, for one strength that you write, you get 3 marks, and for the second strength you write, you get another 3 marks. When you, as a student, divide a 6 mark question into two different questions of 3 marks each, it it makes it easier for you to be able to keep a check and not lose out marks here, right? So consider the 6 mark question as two separate questions of 3 marks each to be able to avoid disproportionate content distribution. So you might as well write down one strength in a paragraph and leave a line, write down another strength worth 3 marks, and you're good to go. How do you get marks over here? You get the first mark for identifying a particular strength. You get the second mark for explaining why the method has a particular strength. That is, in this case, structured interview has a strength. And the third mark for explaining why exactly is your point a strength. In this case, is exactly a strength. Or in other words, whatever the first point is that you've identified, how is it eventually adding to the credibility of any particular research that you're conducting? Towards the end of this lesson, I would like to discuss this particular 6 mark question with you all as well. For now, I just wanted you to see how there has been a question on this. Likewise, there's been a question in November 2023, variant 1 2. This again is a 6 mark question where you as a student have been asked to explain two limitations of structured interviews as a research method. Explain two limitations of structured interviews as a research method. Now, taking this a little further, moving on to the limitations or the weaknesses of using structured interviews in a sociological research. So let's hop on to the limitations real quick. Limitations of structured interviews. Now, when we talk about the limitations of structured interviews, the first limitation, remember, when you as a researcher are designing your research, or when you, in this case, an interviewer, are setting questions, remember, structured interviews are preset or pre-written questions that are verbally asked from the respondent, and the responses or the answers are recorded. So read the researcher might set the questions based on their priorities and concerns. Now, whatever the researcher thinks is important would be a question. I mean, anything that the researcher finds important might possibly be a question in his or her research. Anything that the researcher does not find important might not be a question in that particular research. So in this respect, they have imposed on the participant what they see is important by the researcher. So when you talk about structured interviews, because they are preset questions, I just write the entire thing so that it's easier for you to understand. Because structured interviews contain preset or pre-written questions that are decided beforehand by the interviewer or the researcher in this case. This gives the interviewer immense amount of control over the over his or her over the participant to be able to prioritize their own concerns. Since we're discussing this under the heading of a limitation, what would be the impact to this? The impact to this would be, I just write down the entire thing, consequently leading to the participant having little to no control over the interviewing process. I just realized this has turned into a big paragraph. So yeah, just wanted you all to understand this entire thing. Participants have little amount of control over the interview and no opportunity to qualify the answers or to introduce issues that reflect their concerns. So if you want a shorter version to this, we might as well, if you want to just make pointers out of this as notes, you could simply say that the interviewer or the participant has no control over the interview process. I'll just do that for you so that it's easier. So yeah, here you go. This part, this entire thing was an explanation. If you've understood, you want to write it down, you write it down. You don't want to write it down, this line in itself should suffice. So the participants have no control over the interviewing process. The participants have no control over the interviewing process because it is structured. One. Number two, this is an interview, and when you talk about an interview, there could always be interview bias. Now I remember here we wrote less chance of interview bias. We wrote less chance of interview bias because we were comparing this particular type of interview, that is a structured interview, with the other types of interviews that are semi-structured interviews and unstructured interviews. Nonetheless, if there is an interview taking place, there would be interviewer bias to a greater or lesser degree, to a greater or lesser extent. So if we use the same point as a limitation, we could say interviewer bias is a potential problem with all interviews, including structured interviews. For example, participants may give answers that they think or they see as socially acceptable or that they think will be viewed positively rather than that particular answer revealing their true thoughts, particularly on controversial topics. This is known as the social desirability effect. So we could talk about, we could say structured interviews are nonetheless interviews. I don't know if that makes sense. So structured interviews by the end of the day are interviews, and there would of course be interviewer bias, right? So we could say interviewer bias. Maybe this may be lesser as compared to semi-structured and unstructured interviews. Nonetheless, interviewer bias could be there, usually is there. So interviewer bias leading to participants responding, participants, or in this case, an interviewee responding by giving socially acceptable or desirable responses, which might not be true. So if the responses are not true, your research validity gets questioned, the research credibility is questioned. The findings are questioned then. So the interviewer bias, now this over here, I'm sorry, this is an interview bias. I made a mistake. This is an interview bias. Interview bias. Understand the difference. I use the word interview bias over here. The next could be an interviewer bias. Now understand these limitations that I'm using over here, they stand to be more true when you talk about interviews in general. Understand the difference. This is interview bias, this is interviewer bias, or the person who is conducting an interview, the person who's conducting an interview, that particular individuals, that is the interviewers, the interviewer's age, the interviewer's gender, the interviewer's ethnicity, or for the matter of fact, the interviewer's social class. Could be potential reasons, could be potential factors that lead to the respondent answering in not a true manner, or the respondent not being honest, which again leads to the validity or the accuracy of the findings being questionable, being questioned. Number four, the fourth disadvantage that we could discuss over here could be how these structured interviews, they do not allow, I mean, this I believe would again be an overlap to this do not allow the respondent to discuss something that that is not in line with the preset questions. Now, the last point, that would be a comparison in contrast to this point. Now, remember, positivists support quantitative data and interpretivists support qualitative data. And when interpretivists, they support qualitative data, when interpretivists support qualitative data, they believe that structured interviews, they believe, short on space here, structured interviews cannot provide rich, detailed, meaningful data. Now, these were a few limitations, and right at the top, we had discussed a couple of strengths of the usage of structured interviews in a sociological research. If I may discuss a question that I had shown you all a couple of minutes ago. I'm talking about this question over here that read, explain two strengths of structured interviews. So we had this question in May, June 2021, question number 1-3, session 1-3. Let's put it down over here. I think it was May, June 2021, variant 1-3. The question over here read, explain two strengths of structured interview as a research method. A 6-mark question. So the keyword over here is explain. Explain what? You need to explain two strengths of what? Of a structured interview as a research method. Now, like I said, you get the first mark. So if I talk about the first strength here, I mean, before that, let's discuss the possible points that could be used, picking them from the marking scheme. The first strength you could use over here is high in reliability. Another point could be it has a good response rate. Of course, if you're comparing them with semi-structured and unstructured interviews, because they take a lot of time. Number three, the ease of coding, or rather say codifying answers and creating statistical data. The fourth possible point, no requirement. I mean, you don't need to write all of these, but just so that you have them written in front of you so that you understand it better. No requirement for highly trained or skilled interviewers. Why so? Because remember, in many cases, it is just about reading out questions. Many people see this as a cost and time efficient way compared to other methods. This, of course, overcomes the problem of illiteracy, which we had when we were using questionnaires. So there is less interviewer bias compared to other interviewing methods because the questions are preset, standardized, and would be used for all participants. Now, if we talk about a question of this nature, here you go. Let's just say if we're picking on this particular strength. So this is the strength if we are planning on using. How does this work? You could say structured interviews are high in reliability. This is how you're getting the first mark because the respondents will be answering. Does it look like a will here? Will be answering the same questions it is easy to repeat or replicate the research the particular research can be replicated by other researchers to recheck findings. So I'll just use different colors to highlight so that it's easier for you to understand. This is the first mark. This is how you get the second mark. This is the third mark. So this is how you could ensure that you're not losing any mark. And this is just one strength that I have elaborated on. And yeah, this is, I mean, so is the case. You could answer the other question that had to do with limitations. That is, explain two limitations of structured interviews as a research methods as well on your own. I hope this was helpful. Have a good day. Thank you.